Hi everyone and welcome to our new podcast series, Southpaw Bears All. I'm Ria, Head of Content here at Southpaw. In every podcast episode, we'll be having a new guest join us to explore the topics related to the future of brand building. Joining me today is Niki Macartney, our very own Strategy Director here at Southpaw.
Hello.
And Seamus O'Farrell. So Seamus comes from his agency Brand Salience. He develops brand and communication strategy through the lens of behavioural science. Hi, Seamus.
Hello.
So the topic we're going to be exploring today is called Immortal Brands, and you might wonder why that is such a hot topic. Well, in the wake of the IPA Effectiveness Awards and Les Binet and Peter Field's third study about long-term brand growth and brand health, actually the idea of an immortal brand has never been more timely. Brand death is a real possibility in such a fast-changing marketing landscape. Mark Twain said that there are no new ideas, but there are plenty of solutions out there. So how can we help brands not just survive, but thrive? So Niki, what do we mean by an immortal brand?
Immortal brands. So we all want to imagine a future generation where our brands that we've been working on, that we've been babysitting, we hand them over healthier at the end of our term. You know, whether we're client side or agency side, you know, that's our legacy, isn't it? We want to know that, we want to prove that we've worked on a brand and it's been healthier when we've handed it over. But data suggests that we're less and less likely to be able to achieve that because brands are not living for as long as they used to. A Credit Suisse report shows that the average company lifespan has dropped from 60 years to 20 years, and it's going to drop further down to 12 in less than a decade. So pretty scary statistics. And, you know, as brand managers working on brands in companies that are no longer surviving, you know, leaving that legacy where you're handing over a healthy brand at the end is becoming less and less likely. In 2016, 80 new companies were born in the UK every hour, which is more than babies born. There's virtually no barriers to entry. So you've got new brands popping up everywhere, challenging the established brands with their challenger ways. You know, who thought Glossier would ever be a £100 million business in just 4 years? It's crazy. So, you know, there's so many new brands popping up, and it's meaning that the big established brands are having to really, really think carefully and consider how they grow in this sort of challenging, complex environment. One more statistics that's sort of very close to my heart. 6 years ago, there were 15 gin brands in the UK. Today, there's 500. The Rosewood Hotel around the corner in London has 500 gins. 30 tonics, giving you 14,000 combinations. It's just mind-blowing. I guess these points just illustrate the fact that brands have got to be really considered in how they grow. The environment's complex, constantly challenging, and brand mortality really is a very real prospect.
Okay, so Seamus, can you think of any brands that have actually died out in recent years that have fallen foul of what we're talking about today?
Well, I think that unfortunately there's loads. Woolworths is one that often comes to many people's minds because it's big and it's recent, and there's, you know, Maplins have gone under recently, Toys R Us have gone under recently, Mother's Pride bread hit the skids, and I always think the one that's for me most interesting is, even though it had prime mover advantage, it was a browser called Alta Vista, which actually had better technology behind it than Google. Alta Vista doesn't exist anymore, but you might still have heard of Google. And actually, I think you made a point about being considered, Niki, and I think that's really important because intuitively, marketers often feel that when they're under attack from competitors and death by 1,000 cuts, it's a bit like Gulliver and the Lilliputians, that they should try and adopt the ways of working of these new challenger brands. And actually, probably the best thing for them to do is to refrain the idea of brand management and innovation to be brand maintenance. Actually, stop tinkering. Do what made you famous in the first place, continuing investing behind that. And once you've continued that considered path, then you can start experimenting with new ways of working that match tit for tat what the others are doing.
Absolutely.
So that there's again, intuitively we're told, we feel, we hear that everything's changing. Actually, one of the important things to consider in life, let alone marketing and communications is what's not changing. Because when you're big and you understand what's not changing, that's still a big area. And then it's a platform for you to go and try and act more modern, if you like. But trying to act all modern and changing 180 degrees the way you've been working for the previous 30, 40 years, actually, that's the recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Looking at grocery shopping, we're told that shopping habits have changed and we're in a revolutionary new cycle of shopping behaviour and how retailers need to deliver. Now let's just look at some empirical data from the Kantar World Panel. In 2009, the average British shopper was doing about 12.2 big shop trips a year. So sort of once every 3 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. If you wind, that's in 2009, if you wind forward to the current day, they're currently doing maybe slightly less, about 11.9 big shop trips a year. And in terms of top-up shops, 2009 they were doing about a top-up shop every 1.6 days, and it's now about every every 1.3 days. So it's slightly higher frequency. So it's not a huge behaviour change, but what's happening is in the big shops they're putting slightly less into the basket, and in the top-up shops they're putting slightly more into the basket, and across the population that adds up to a lot of revenue, retail sales revenue. But the behaviour hasn't revolutionised. A lot of it stayed the same. So that's really important, because if retailers think, shoppers have totally changed behaviour, they'll end up going down rabbit holes, which is why some of them are going down under.
Is there also a slight shift, perhaps, which is fueling this in not perhaps the channel that they're purchasing? So online shops, those sorts of things, rather than actually footfall in store. Is that going to have an impact and perhaps fuel this idea of change when in fact it's not that?
Well, that is changing hugely. But I think e-commerce, and don't hold me to this, is it somewhere between 15 and 17% of our retail stock in value terms in the UK? So it's growing. That's not insignificant. It's also not huge. So I think it's about understanding the balance of what isn't changing as well as what is. Because the problem is what everybody's focusing on today is what is changing.
Yeah.
And that's important, but it means, as you said earlier, Nikki, you're taking your eye off the core.
So I think there's probably some traps, some bad behaviours. I think you've got some intel on that, Nikki. Tell us about those bad behaviours.
Certainly have. I've got 4 of these bad traps that we're falling foul of up my sleeve. I think we've got to acknowledge that as marketeers, which side of the fence we sit, client or agency, we are partly to blame for brand mortality. We've identified what we call the 4 ills of modern marketing, and as I said, they're these behaviours that we're falling foul of. I'll just introduce you to the first one, shall I?
Yes, please.
This is called FOMO, the fear of missing out, and it's brilliantly characterised by the magpie. This dangerous behaviour is also known as shiny object syndrome. And basically it's the fear of missing out in marketing. You might recognise it in your teams, your agencies, yourself even. We conducted some quant research amongst senior decision makers in marketing in the UK, and we asked them to what extent do they agree that marketeers are adopting new technology, new trends and new platforms just because they're new without sufficient strategic thought as to whether they are right for their brands. So staggeringly, 82% of these decision makers agreed yes. Their biggest motivations for change were to be seen to be trying something new.
So actually they're kind of succumbing to the pressure from the boss rather than actually potentially thinking about what's going to be right for the consumer and the bottom line, the brand.
Certainly a pressure coming from somewhere to be trying to be seen to do something new.
Yeah.
I always think like one of the casualties, as Seamus has just been talking about, really, one of the casualties of this FOMO behaviour is the lack of consistency, which we know is one of the really important drivers of how brands grow. Old Byron Sharp's principle.
Yeah, Byron Sharp.
People don't engage with brands, they just buy. And how they buy is either on habit, they do it time and time again, or they buy because it's high on mental availability, it's really front of mind. And what makes a brand mentally available is being consistent. Regular, consistent messaging and distinctive assets. So every time a new brand manager comes on board, they want to create their own legacy. You know, I've done it, we've all done it. It causes a chain reaction of changes that affect a brand's consistency. I always like to think about brand manager years a bit like dog years. So for every 18 months in a brand manager's life is probably 3 months in a consumer's life. We freshen things up and feel the constant need to change. We've done that, so we've got to move on. But actually consumers see so little of what brands do that, you know, we need to just slow it down a bit and stop changing so much. In old language, you know, TV ads would wear out in something like 3 years. When was the last time we created a piece of content that lasted 3 years?
God, 3 days you'll be lucky.
Yeah, 3 hours even. Yeah, so, you know, I think there's a lot of sort of support and data behind how FOMO and this fear of missing out is affecting things.
You know, I think that it's almost like think of a pincer movement. You've got short-termism, which actually has been driven by big companies needing no longer to report just once a year, or even up until 10 years ago, half yearly, every 6 months. Big companies now have to report, whether they're quoted or not, every 3 months. And that causes panic in the boardroom. And it basically says the chief executive and the chief financial officer say to the chief marketing officer, give us a return on investment in the next 3 months, or you lost your job. Exaggerating to make a point, but perhaps not exaggerating that much. No. So there's an immediate drive, adrenaline rush within the organisation to just do quick fix stuff that gets an immediate return. Now, there is a mathematical issue with that, which is even if you get, say, a 15% return on investment on a £1 million expenditure, that's not a big number. So they're constantly chasing high ROIs on small numbers, which deliver, wait for it, small numbers. So that's the first thing. So it's been driven by the frequency of reporting.
Yeah.
So
that's
the board,
some tiny quarterly
top down,
cycle.
Keep going, driving short-term return, which does not drive, therefore, effective long-term return. Then the shiny new thing is obviously been accelerated, like petrol on a fire, by technology and social media. And also people of a certain age coming into even the established within the professions of marketing and agency world are using this stuff all the time, and therefore they think that the rest of the world is using this stuff all the time. Fascinating. A couple of some research from Thinkbox, and just 2 really interesting bits from this research. And this was it was a very rigorous sample looking at people who work in marketing and advertising and their view of the world, and of their view of the world and how they behave in their world, and also what's their view of how real people, normal people, nurses and builders out there,
normals
behave.
Walking the street,
indeed,
not in their echo chamber.
And then looking at what normal people out there say that they do or don't do in terms of media usage. A couple of really interesting things. So, marketing people's estimate of what normal people consume daily on YouTube is 1 hour, 21 minutes. And ad people's estimate of what normal people consume in terms of video on demand, broadcast on demand every day, is 1 hour and 21 minutes. And their view on what streaming normal people do is about 1.5 hours a day. Now, actually, what normal people estimate themselves to do on YouTube is 40 minutes, video on demand 36 minutes, and subscription, Netflix, 32 minutes a day. Now, this data's a year old, so it's not that old, but there's a huge discrepancy on what ad people think other people do and what real people think they do. Now, this is claimed usage, but nonetheless,
is this coming from people to give a guesstimate?
When you look at how people use social media, we think that everybody out there uses social media. So, ad people, I use LinkedIn 93% of 93% of any week I'm using LinkedIn. Normal people, it's 14%. Facebook, 90% ad people, Normal people, 62%. Twitter, 81% ad people, 22% normal people. And Netflix, 83% ad people, 30% normal people. So what we do in our bubble of London and the South East and the marketing density there and sort of parts of Manchester and Birmingham, we think that because we're using it all the time, mental availability, so is everybody else. They're not. Not in Macclesfield or Sheffield. I remember I was up home in North and I said to my best mate, I didn't really like Uber because I'm a traditionalist. I like to get into black cabs because they know where they're going.
Go in the bus lanes.
Go in the bus lanes. And he said, what's Uber? You know,
it illustrates the point very nicely, doesn't it? Niki, is there any other casualties of this magpie who's FOMOing its way around the marketing department?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the one that always comes to mind is just the focus on innovation means you often neglect the core of the brand, the core of what made you successful in the first place. Loads of examples where NPD and innovation attracts far more attention than it should do, given its profit contribution. Again, 2003, I think it was, Kit Kat decided they would focus on innovation. I think they launched a lemon meringue pie and a low carb variant and some Seville oranges or something like that. And they also dropped their brand campaign. You know, they dropped their famous line of "Have a break, have a Kit Kat," and all hell broke loose. They reintroduced that and kind of turned things around very, very quickly. But classic example of where you neglect what made you really strong and popular in the first place. Interestingly, noticed Brewdog relatively recently launched a TV network. Yeah. So you're paying £4.99 a month to have access to, you know, their content. You know, is this brilliance or is this madness?
Well, it looks like they're trying to do the moving from being a brewery to being an entertainment business and trying to do a Red Bull. And is anyone except Red Bull able to do a Red Bull? I would question that, and I don't know if I paid £4.99. Would you, Seamus?
No, I certainly wouldn't, and I don't think that the vast majority of people would. Obviously, we'll have to see the data in the fullness of time. So give it a year and we'll see. I suspect it won't be particularly impressive. Having said that, on Red Bull, there is a difference between what they're doing and Brewdog, which is Red Bull don't actually do a lot of conventional advertising, but they do a lot of high visibility events. So their equivalent of advertising is events, and it ties into a brand truth or a product truth of energy. So actually, what they do is very effective advertising, primarily for free.
For them,
But you know, when you look at data from, you know, Barb and TGI and Nielsen about actual how people behave and consume media, when it comes to commercial media, and you know, TV is still the king, and social media is quite a difficult medium to engage people, get to people when it comes to talking to them about brands, getting them to pay for content from a brand. That's a tall order.
I think it is
very much so. So moving on to our next ill.
Yeah.
What have you got for us, Niki?
This is the dope rush, characterised by our addict. And as you've alluded to already in Les Binet and Peter Field's latest series of kind of effectiveness in context, you're seeing more and more and more evidence of this coming from brands. So the dope rush is the addiction to short-termism that Seamus will go on to talk about in a minute. But it's basically being addicted to the short-termism, the immediate highs that come from being able to prove your brand successes in the short term. Digital developments mean we can measure and evaluate how our digital activity is working. And naturally, marketeers are translating and transforming and shifting over, redirecting loads of their budgets to the short-term marketing, which you'd sort of define as more tactical sales driving, persuasive, behavioural driving mechanics.
So it's this quarterly hamster wheel that Seamus alluded to.
Great in the short term, everyone's happy, seeing big numbers, lots of great results, but the big but is that it's not growing brands over the long term. less and less brand activity is being done, which is what is actually drives long-term profitable growth.
So how long would a brand owner have to commit, hold fast, try and hold their job down long enough than that 3-month period to actually see that long-term cumulative effect of the brand growth? How long have they got to hold fast?
Oh my God, I don't think anyone could tell you the answer to that. But what they do know is that you've got this sort of sweet spot where sales activations generate uplift, and at about 6 months you get this line that takes over with the profitable brand growth. So the brand building, go on to Walk or the IPA website and have a look at the effectiveness chart that shows how marketing works in 2 ways, short-term versus long-term. And there's this sort of, at 6 months, you tend to get a cumulative growth effect of brand building. And over time, it delivers more and more and more effectiveness. A brand manager's got to be there for longer than 18 months, put it that way, to start to see significant brand changes and underlying brand growth. We did this study against senior decision makers, and that shows that they believe that without a greater focus on long-term brand building, that they fear their brand could die out in the next 10 years. So nearly 60% of decision makers agreed with that stat. So quite staggering. 93% of them want to see a greater focus on the long term in their departments. The great thing is that there's an awareness. That's part of the problem, isn't it? You're aware of it, but the IPA data shows that short-termist activity is still growing year on year on year, and it's never been at such high levels, but needed so desperately.
Okay, so we haven't kicked the chocolate bars just yet, but we've acknowledged that we've got a big problem.
No, exactly.
But I think the one of the issues here is that amongst marketers, and I'm primarily talking about the client side of the equation, but actually, to be fair, unfortunately, the agency side of the equation too, the knowledge that just saying we want to focus on long-term growth may be correct, but the knowledge, the information, the argument, the psychology, the data to convince the chief executive and the chief financial officer, they haven't got. They haven't got to their fingertips. So they, as marketers, even senior marketers, may want long-term growth correctly, but they can't explain why it's so important and how to get it, and how you won't be overlooking the short term, because if you're building a brand successfully in the long term, it doesn't just work in the long term, it works in the here and now, but overall it's a more sustainable thing. So how do you bring data to the table, to the C-suite, that enables the C-suite to say, okay, I better hold my nerve and look to the long term?
I just want to put out there that I'm not like chasing the long-term brand building bandwagon, and no one should be. All the data and the latest series of effectiveness in context says it's about balance. It's that big word, balance. So we talk about it as carbs and sugar. You need both of them in your diet. You just got to get that right balance. And it's, generally speaking, it's 60% should be behind your time and investment. Resources should be behind brand building, and 40% through short-term sales driving mechanics. If you're in financial services, that's probably a lot higher, up to 80% should be behind brand building. But depending on your brand, which category you're in, where you are in your life cycle depends, but you do need both, and it's about finding the right balance.
And it's amazing how Burnett and Field's brilliant meta-analysis of the IPA effectiveness data bank has consistently shown that, although there are, according to different categories, there are nuances in terms, but the ratio, it's a sort of Pareto, isn't it? Essentially.
Yeah.
But when you look at buyer behaviour and buyer data, the very simple reason, as the Edinburgh Bass Institute say empirically in all cases, is that short-term promotions tend to be seen by, and this makes logical sense when you stand back and think about it, and certainly borne out by the data, price promotions, which are generally on for about 3/4 of the year for most brands in most grocery contexts and others, they are bound to be more likely seen by heavier buyers of your brand, people who would be buying you anyway. So what you're doing is you're giving price promotions to people who would be buying you anyway. So you're giving a cheaper product to people who would be buying you anyway at your full price, or at a higher likelihood.
Rewarding loyalty.
Rewarding loyalty, but by giving those heavy buyers something that they don't actually need because they'd have bought you anyway. And because it's counterintuitive, and science often is, the people we need to reach are the infrequent buyers, because there's so many millions more out there of those buyers. And the chances are that a price promotion is going to miss them.
So it's a little bit like category targeting versus just going in for those that are going to be looking at narrow audience who are already
absolutely
receptive to your message.
Which is the whole brand building belief, which is around emotional priming. Those millions in the mass reach audience. So when they are at fixture, they've got you in their sort of latent awareness to buy.
Yeah. And I think there's a snippet from the Binet and Field work of more emotional investment that you can give a piece of content or a piece of advertising, the more likely that person is going to make that purchase.
Be memorable.
Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, a couple of things. The grounding insight that I always start with is that for the vast majority of people do not care about the vast majority of brands in the vast majority of categories or their brand choices.
Hold the front page. They don't care about what you're doing.
Which is why an understanding of psychology and a scientific approach to marketing is so important for brands and marketers and agencies to understand and put in place, because it's about influence, not persuasion. It's about evoking emotion and behaviour as a result of emotion, rather than some rational argument. And the fact of the matter is that human beings, and this, increasingly in the literature, there is an acceptance that we don't have really the free will that traditional philosophy tells us. Human beings do not have free will, or certainly microscopic proportion of free will to what we traditionally thought, because the vast majority of our decisions are made from below the level of consciousness, from emotional impulses, and this is across our whole lives, let alone when we're coming to think about not very hard and choose things we don't really care about, brands.
So we're 2 down, 2 more to go. Third up, what have we got, Nikki?
Binge, sort of epitomised by the glutton. Oh my God, we've been stuffing our faces, haven't we, with content. This behaviour is all about our obsession with content. We're making and consuming way too much content than is either mentally possible, like how much can we consume, or morally correct. And I know that's one of your kind of big issues, isn't it, with content?
Certainly. I think the ethics around overproduction now has reached sort of peak noise, and if you read a couple of weeks ago, head of the NHS has demanded a tax levy from social media platforms to help them service people coming to the NHS with mental health issues around the cognitive dissonance that often happens because of overuse. And that, the fact that you've got that addictive feedback loop with the like button, it's tapped into serotonin, and it's actually very unhealthy. So yeah, bit of a passion project for me.
Really interesting. The proliferation of channels and marketing budgets being stretched further than ever before, and the availability of easy ways to create content, means consumers are now bombarded with millions and millions of pieces of content each day. If I wanted to, I could produce all my brand's content in my kitchen in Adobe Spark. Clearly it would look pretty shit, but anyone can produce content and put it out there. And didn't you say something like, to consume all the content that is
aimed
put at you every day, you'd be consuming for 36 hours?
And you wouldn't, that's no toilet breaks.
But I look at my phone on the toilet. What's wrong with that?
Go for it, Nikki. Find your 36 hours in a day.
According to Havas's Meaningful Brand Report, 60% of content is clutter.
I think that's being quite conservative.
Yeah, I do. And content produced was up something like 35%, but the effectiveness or the engagement dropped by 17%. I think we had some interesting stats as well that I can't remember what they were.
If you wind back 30 years or so, and people being asked the question, do you generally enjoy the advertising that you see on television? Back in the late 70s and through the 80s, the figure was probably in the sort of mid to high 70% 70% range. And I can't remember the exact figures off the top of my head, but over that 30-year period, it's pretty progressively, consistently dropped. I'd say it's somewhere in the region of 30% nowadays. So the issue of quality, the issue of, or the question of entertainment, whether that's causing someone to laugh or cry or be provoked to think something in a different way, that requires real skill from communicators, from agencies, whether you're talking about above-the-line advertising or really effective, evocative direct mail or effective content, and content is a very ill-defined term.
It's a somewhat amorphous being.
Indeed. But it's really hard creating an entertaining ad. So if you're creating, as an agency, for example, 100 pieces of content for your various clients across every week, is each of those 100 bits of content really, really engaging?
How good is it going to be?
Because not only is there too much of it, but is it just a waste of time and effort?
Yeah, I think we all need to have a self-check, which is if your content's not entertaining, informative, rewarding or useful, then don't bloody do it. Do not spew out content for the sake of it, and do not accept briefs which are, can you milk this for, and squeeze as much content out of this idea as you possibly can, because it's not necessary and it's not healthy and it's not right. And we don't need it. Brands don't need it. It's not growing brands.
No one's got that many interesting things to say that many times a day. No one. And it's certainly something that I've seen people brands fall down the rabbit hole, particularly with social media. And actually a bit of old school marketing strategic rigor applied to this quite new world of content would mean that content that can therefore be elevated to become something that contributes to long-term brand health.
Absolutely. And a bit like the point about promotions more readily reach frequent, heavier buyers. People who interact, again, bit of an amorphous word, but people who look at brands, interact with brands in some shape or form on Facebook, for example, or other social media, they will tend to be heavier buyers of that brand.
Yeah.
Because infrequent buyers just aren't that interested to look at what Coca-Cola's doing on social media. In fact, most of their heavy buyers aren't that interested. So to looking at social media in terms of, is it an effective reach medium for helping me reach critically infrequent buyers in order to grow penetration, is the sort of the first question. And if you go back to the wonderful ThinkBot research, it's very easy for us in our bubble, our marketing world bubble, to think that because we use all this brilliant stuff, and it is brilliant, that other people do in Macclesfield, and unfortunately they don't.
No. It's about recognising the power of a channel, what it can do, and also recognising it for what it can't do. Certainly community building with content is for loyalists, but actually the mass reach capabilities of something like Facebook, can be very helpful for your brand.
Just that mantra of less is more is the name of the game for content.
So let's find out what that final ill is about. Niki, over to you.
Fake news, the word of 2017. Anyone can publish information now. It's the buzzword, isn't it? Even a couple of days ago, Trump talking again about fake news. Shrewd publishers want to make the headlines. And yet the problem is that when we talk to these senior decision makers in the UK, over 60% of them are unsure or unclear what facts to believe when making their brand decisions. So when we look at fake news applied to sort of marketing, brands, etc., it's confusing and in some cases it's wrong. Often the news is about change, out with the old and in with the new, and that's sort of kind of links to the other ills, doesn't it, about the kind of the fear of missing out and stuff like that. So one that often pops into my head is obviously TV is dead. That it's all about digital viewing. We see marketers therefore moving away from TV and investing, moving away from mass marketing and TV and investing in short-term digital content. And as Seamus, I'm sure you'll back up, a lot of those stats are rubbish, aren't they?
Well,
TV has become more effective.
Yes.
Myth versus fact.
You could say, the viewing of television is in inexorable decline, but inexorable sounds worse than it actually is because it's quite gradual, and it's still by far the box in the actual living room watching television in real time is by far the most consumed media activity still. Now, but young people don't watch television that much. Well, firstly, they never did, because they should either have been doing their homework, or they were out playing with friends, or exploring, getting to know people of, have a bit of fun.
Quick fag behind the bike sheds.
And
fag and a fumble.
And as they get older, they start to become staid adults like the rest of us have become, in my case. And they watch more television. It's the pattern doesn't change. It may be slightly lower overall, but the pattern doesn't change, which is why television, counterintuitively, is the cheapest medium in terms of cost per thousand of reaching human beings who also watch commercial television. Also, the concept of ad avoidance, because people are multitasking and doing things. Well, ad avoidance has always happened, and it's no bigger or smaller than it always has been. People have either, during the commercial break, gone to have a pee or make a cup of tea, about a third of people. A third of people play with the dog, or read the paper, or nowadays look at the laptop or whatever it is.
Get on the phone.
And a third of people actually pay attention to the ads, not assiduously, but they actually watch passively what's on air. Now, the first third, you're never going to reach them because they're out of the room. And the ones who are watching, is still a third of people watching. But the ones who are playing with the dog, if they hear that, they've heard a McDonald's impression. So the power of television advertising, even when it's not being visibly viewed, watched with eyes, still has very powerful aural cues and heuristics. Absolutely. So, but that is not to say that you should only look at television. It's about how you add cover creatively using digital channels in addition to TV, and it's about which end of the telescope you look through. So TV isn't dead. TV isn't a dinosaur. So we need to understand that some of the eternal verities are cool.
I think it's the point of this is all of that brilliant fake news. The marketing industry is not exempt from fake news. So, it's about kind of, thinking and questioning and doing your research and, don't believe the headlines. And just because somebody says something doesn't mean to say it's true.
Yeah. That has been such a fascinating discussion. And as we've been going through, I've been taking lots and lots of notes. And I'm going to do my best to surmise exactly what we've been, sort of the nub of what we've been getting at, really. And so not just the problems and the behaviours and the bad habits that we've been getting into with our 4 ills, but some solutions that brands can apply to not just survive, but thrive. First of all, it's fair to say that this is a hugely complex topic, and ultimately it comes down to each individual brand manager to figure out the very specific nuances in category, in market for their brand. But some really striking things are coming out of this. First of all, quality over quantity, particularly in the world of content and social media, is hugely important. And Seamus will like this, emotional engagement here. To really get that long-term profitability and make people feel something, not just have you in their price comparison website and make a really rational and tactical sort of sale. Navigating through rules and rigour, consistency applies with everything that we're doing. And it really is a balancing act for brand managers. It's about the long term, but it's also finding the right balance of the tactics and the shorter term stuff. So we're looking for omnivorous brand managers out there, not just carnivores. And finally, strong leadership, both brand and agency side. Hold your nerve and stick to what your brand is best known for. I'd like to wrap up and say thank you, Niki and Seamus. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure, treasure.
Thank you very much.